bulletin. Todd's still available in the back. On the front is our announcements. There's quite a few for this week. And then on the back is a place to take some notes for our message for today, just so you can track of our conversation. But as we dive in, I shared this little story about our house, I think a couple weeks ago. But when we had first moved into our home, and again, most of you guys know where we live, we first moved to our home, we discovered pretty quickly that we had some other residents that were living there. We had bats in our attic. Right, I had gone up there, I forget why, soon after we had moved there, and I'm hearing this squeaking. And at first I'm like, are there birds outside? And I get a flashlight, and I see this little box almost that is naturally created by the way your eaves kind of overhang outside the house. And they essentially were roosting in there, and they had a whole little litter of bats. And guys, if you guys don't know me yet, I hate bats. Right? They're so ick and they're gross. I appreciate the fact that they eat all the bugs, and they're not, to me, as bad as mice and other things, but I still detest bats, particularly in my home. And so what I did, like any homeowner would do, I do everything I can to try to get rid of these things, and I try all the gimmicky things that you can do, right? I put up the little ultrasonic sound things that are supposed to, like, make them not want to be there, right? We can't hear it, supposedly they can. That didn't work. I got these little bags that have like these smells in them, and I put them all around in the attic, and that didn't work. It just, made my attic smell like potpourri. And all these things, right? Again, bats are hard, as you guys know. It's not like mice, right, that you can trap. Bats, I mean, they disappear when you see them. They slip in and out. They can find any crevice. And so I'm doing everything I can to create this space to be unwelcome for the bats, right? Bat spray, trying to get rid of the smell, to let them know this is not a place to be. I even went as far as putting a bat house on my garage. So that way, I still want them on my property, right? I want them eating the bugs. I just don't want them in my house. And so they didn't like that either. And so I'm going through all these things, all these gimmicky things to try to get rid of my bats. Yet none of these devices and items seem to work, right? I was wasting money and time and energy, right, on this idea that I had these little rodents living in my house, right? I hated it. And this is a thing that we've all experienced in some capacity, right? Things that are supposed to help us can sometimes fail us, right? That little ultrasonic device was supposed to help me. It didn't work, right? Those smells didn't do much. The things that are supposed to help us sometimes end up frustrating us, right? It's frustrating when things that are supposed to help us end up failing us. And again, we've all had experiences like that, from gimmicky sales things to try to get rid of bats to bigger things in life, right? Whether it be maybe a school system, different leaders in our life. They're meant to help us, but they fail us. And maybe you come in today to the doors of the church, and that's been your experience with church as a whole. You have some concept of an idea that, hey, the church is supposed to be a helpful and encouraging place, yet to you it has not been. It has failed you. It seems like everyone else comes here and they're encouraged and they leave and they have this great relationship with the church, but you're just here, right, checking your box. And it feels like church is failing you. You say the worship service doesn't do much for me, right? You got a problem with the messages. And I do too sometimes, right? Maybe they're a little too long, right? A little too short. Maybe they're boring. Maybe they're impractical, right? Maybe you have an issue with the music. It's too long. It's not the right kind. There's not enough of it. Maybe you have an issue with other people in the context of the church, right? That person didn't talk to me. That person sat too close to me. This person thought that they could call me during the week, right? You have this relationship with the church that just feels like it's failing you, right? Maybe even as simple as like today, I kind of had a problem last night figuring out what temperature this room should be. Do I turn the heat on or the air conditioning on, right? I don't know. So if you're hot or cold, I apologize. But here's the thing, right? Sometimes things that are supposed to help us can end up failing us, and it's frustrating and it's hard. And the reality is, High Prairie Community Church, we certainly have room for growth as a church, right? And maybe you come here today and you're thinking, High Prairie Community Church, I'm just here checking off the box, but this church is not meeting my spiritual needs, right? And as the pastor of this church, I would say we certainly, as a church, have much room for growth. But I want to challenge you first, before you begin blaming the church for your ills and your problems, I want to challenge you to first consider your own life. Right? Are you in a place where you're ready to be poured into you? Do you come here like ready to grow, ready to open up Scripture and learn? Or are you looking for a church just to kind of meet your needs? Because I have found that many people who are critical of the church, whether it be this one or any church whatsoever, often have heart problems that need to be addressed. All right, some churches deserve criticism. I'll grant you that. But often, it's not so much the church's issue sometimes as it is the person who walks in the door. Right? We all have heart issues that we bring into this setting that impact how we relate to each other. And here's something I want you to think about before we kind of dive into our text. The reality is, right, if you call yourself a follower of Jesus, did you know that makes you the church? Right? You are the church. We're just gathering here in a local setting. And so all the problems that you have with the church are in part your problems. Right? So when we talk about the church, it's not just those people, it's us, it's me, it's you. And so if you love the church, like I do, both High Prairie Community Church and the Church Universal, right? All the followers of Christ. If you love the church, then one of the best things you can do is to not be afraid to look inward at your own life. Again, I'll grant you that often, sometimes churches do hurt people. I'm sure this church has, and I've hurt people, right? We're all broken people gathering here. But the reality is often we bring our own struggles and our own problems into this setting, and it impacts our ability to fully engage well. And so the question I want us to wrestle with this morning, it's there on your bulletin, is why doesn't the church worship service do much for me? Right, again, maybe you're just here checking off the box. You're not fully engaged, and you're frustrated with your experience. I've had those times and those moments, so I understand. But we're going to kind of wrestle with it because this is what's going on in the Corinthian church during this season, right? Their gatherings, as they come together, they're not flowing well. There's disruption, there's disunity, there's discord. So we're in week 10 of this series, From Drift to Direction, right? We're beginning to kind of wind this down. And we're looking at 1 Corinthians today, chapter 11, from verse 2 to 34, right? So pretty much the entirety of it. We decided to cover verse 1 last week because that's how I divided it up. But we're looking at chapter 11, looking at this letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthian church. And once again, right, he helped to establish this church. He spent over a year and a half of his time with this church, teaching them, pouring into them. So he's got to know this people pretty well. And as we've mentioned, he left to go do other ministry, and he's getting letters and from this church, and he's finding out that things are not going well. So this letter is his attempt to help correct them, to reorient them, to help them model Christ better. And again, the gatherings now, and this is kind of some context where we'll go today, the gatherings are not going well. So he writes this section in chapter 11 to help get their attention about the behavior. Because there's some individuals feeling frustrated about their gatherings. It's not a place of encouragement. Right? They're coming together, as we'll see, they're coming together, and they're not better off because they came together. They're worse off. Right? That should not be the story of any church, right? You come here, and I hope you leave encouraged and better off because you've been here and interacted with everyone here. So from drift to direction, right? Why doesn't the church worship do much for me? Now, as I've mentioned before, I was an RA in college, and part of my responsibilities was to help take care of the needs of a group of young men in the college dorm. So I had the whole floor. It was the second floor of the dorm, probably anywhere from 35 to 40 guys. Most of them, this is their first time really like living outside the home. They're learning just basic responsibilities, right? One, they're trying to do school somewhat independently. They don't have mom or dad breathing down their neck, though some tried from a distance. They're learning, right, what it means to do their own laundry, to make their beds, like these simple things. And so as an RA, you're there for all of their needs. And what we would do at our school is once a week, you would come through and we would have just kind of, they call it room inspections. And the idea was, you couldn't be a slob, right? It's not fair to your roommate that you got laundry piled up, or that you're literally sleeping on just your bare mattress, because guys would do that, and it's disgusting. And so we'd come through once a week, and we would just address these issues, right? The bathrooms could be gross. And one week, I went through, and I'm kind of just basic checklist, right? It's really not that deep. It's just honestly common courtesy for people you're sharing a room with. And this one room had a bathroom that looked horrible. I mean, it was bad. The toilet was clearly clogged for several days, and these guys decided to keep using it. And later on, I asked them about it, and they said, oh, it's not a big deal. When we got to go number one, we just go there, but number two, we go across the hall. And so they just continued to use this toilet. And so I'm like, all right, guys, can you tell me what's wrong with this picture, right? First off, it smells horrible. But second off, you need to take care of this issue. And so I tell them, right, clean it. I'll come back later as I kind of walk through in the evening just to make sure you took care of it. And so I came back later, and this individual, the one who's responsible for, or one of them who was, told me about the story he had as he was trying to clean it. This got kind of interesting. All right, so imagine this toilet's backed up. These guys are going number one in it all week. And this individual thinks, you know what cleaning product I'm going to dump in there? I'm going to dump some bleach in there, right? It's going to clean it really well. And so, as you guys know, what's included in number one is a lot of ammonia. And then he's dumping bleach in there, creating this toxic gas. For which he tells me soon after kind of washing stuff around the bowl, he finds himself on the bathroom floor. And I'm like, dude, you are not that clever. And that was just symptomatic of this guy as well, right? Knock the student out, right? So don't go home and mix bleach and ammonia. So anyways, here's my point to tell the story. He took this cleaning product and he used it with no regard for how it should be used or how it should not be used. If you grab a bleach bottle, it tells you don't mix it with ammonia. This guy did it. And I would say he would have ignored those instructions, but the reality was he was probably completely ignorant of those instructions, right? He had an idea of how things should work. This is a cleaning product. It should work in this setting. He was trying to impose his will, per se, upon that. And it didn't go well for him. I think he lost a few brain cells. Here's the thing. We often try to impose our will upon God, trying to tell the designer how things should work. We try to tell God how our life should go. We try to tell him what to do. We try to tell him how his church is supposed to run. You see the tension there, right? The very individual who created it, who designed it, his creation is trying to tell him how his creation should work. And you'll find yourself knocked out on the bathroom floor when you try to do that, right? There's that image for you. So here's the thing. If the church service doesn't seem to be working for you, one thing to consider, right? We're evaluating our hearts today. One thing to consider is maybe you're ignoring God's very design, not only for the church, but for your life as well. So finally, let's dive into this text. Paul starts out here in verse 2. Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I delivered them to you. Which I think this opening statement's very interesting. Because what Paul lets them know is even though you got a lot wrong, there's some things that you're doing well. Right? There's certain things that you haven't forgotten. There's certain traditions that you are still maintaining as I've passed down to you. And even for you, right, you've been a part of different churches, even some of the most unhealthy churches I've been a part of, there's still things that they get right. But the goal is figuring out, right, where are you getting things wrong? What do you need to address? And so Paul starts out by commending them, right? You guys haven't got everything wrong, but there's certainly a lot we need to address here. In verse 3, unpack this, and you'll kind of see how this relates to the gathering of the church, but also us as individuals in our homes. I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ. The head of a wife is her husband. And the head of Christ is God. All right, this is not a conversation that we sometimes like to have in our culture. But this is how God designed the church to run, and this is how he designed our homes to run. And I kind of got it there in order, right? You see God the Father over God the Son, over the husband, over the wife. And we're going to unpack that more and more as we go on here. But clearly, the Corinthian church has this out of order. They're getting things out of whack. And I want you to realize that this order doesn't mean this an order of superiority. Right? If we have a good view of the Trinity, God the Father is not greater than God the Son. Right? And that means that the husband is not greater than the wife, but what we have here is an order of design in which it speaks to responsibility and leadership, right? God the Father makes the plans, God the Son executes them, and the husband is serving God the Son as the wife helps him, right? You kind of see this order. And so what this is it's a system of order, not only for the church, but for the home as well. And so you're probably thinking, all right, Justin, why are we talking about the home? I thought we were talking about the church. I'm glad you asked that, right? And we're going to get to that in a moment. But something to keep in mind, what takes place in the context of our home is going to overflow into our church. And this is why Paul is addressing this, right? It speaks to responsibility and leadership. And this is one of the reasons why, even in the context of our church, right? We believe that men and women are important and they're gifted, but we believe God has different designs for the different genders, and that's why even in our church, we reserve certain leadership positions for only men. That is a core conviction of our church. Paul goes on here, verses 4 through 6, and something to realize as we read through this that some churches often miss. This is unique to their cultural situation, right? So it's not unique that men are to lead their wives, but what is unique is how it's manifested during their time. Because as we read through this very quickly, you'll see we don't necessarily do this in our church. So let's read through this. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. Right? We are not checking hats at the door. Right? We're not checking hair lengths at the door. Clearly, this is culturally unique to the Corinthian church. And so, why has it been preserved for us to read today? How does this pertain to God's design? Well, women during that day and age, as they gathered, they would cover their heads if they were married as a sign of sexual modesty and submission to their husband. And men, verse 4, did not cover their head because that's what women did. Right? We didn't want to confuse gender roles. And these practices were especially important for men who were in the church and representing Christ through their actions. Right? It says something about the unity of spouses when this was the practice that they held to in public. It said something about God's design and their willingness to follow it. And there's a lot more we can unpack there, but I want you to understand as we read that, again, it's culturally unique to the context of the church of how they manifest God's design. Verse 7, for a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. So God created both men and women in his image, and their existence is intended to bring him glory. And because of the position and the role of a man and a woman, right, the husband is doing his best to honor Christ, and the woman is doing her best to honor Christ. As she does that, she is working with and complimenting her husband. Again, sometimes not a message that's popular in our culture today, but this is God's design. And we'll kind of, again, flesh this out more as we walk through our text. But I just want you to keep in mind, as we read this, if you have pauses, and you're like, that sounds kind of sexist, Justin, I want you to really reflect here for a moment. Read through it again. It's not a negative statement regarding women. This is a statement regarding design that I believe is made clear in the next 6 verses. Let's look at those. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man, right? Going back to Genesis, right? God created man, and then from Adam's rib, he created Eve. That's what he's referencing. Neither was man for woman, but woman for man. Again, going back to Genesis, right? Adam came before Eve, and God realized that it was not good for man to be alone. And so God created a helper, a complementer, someone to complete this guy. Verse 10, that is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. And if you could figure out what that means theologically, you're far smarter than many other theologians. They wrestle with what that means. But clearly there's a representation, again, of her head being covered and how God's design works at that time. Verse 11, nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of women. And this is interesting. Right, here's the thing. If you read just that first part, you're like, man, this is pretty sexist, right? Woman's just there, and she's not independent. She's there for her husband. Well, here's the thing. Men need their wives just as much as wives need their husband, right? This is God's design. For woman was made from man, going back to Adam and Eve, right? Eve came out of Adam. And this is interesting. Here's the switch. So man is now born from woman, right? There is not only an emotional, relational need, but there's a physical need, right? We need women. All things are from God. Judge for yourself. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Again, reflecting back on what he said in verses, I believe, 6 through 7, or verses 4 through 6, as he talks about this cultural understanding of how they display God's design in public, right? A reflection of the design itself. It's a few more verses. You could read those if you want. Again, Paul calls us again to reflect on God's design. And so again, you're like, hey, Justin, I thought we were setting up to talk about how we get along as a church. Well, here's the thing. What goes on in our home impacts the church. And so maybe the church service doesn't do much for you because you're fundamentally ignoring God's design at home. Right? Maybe you're ignoring God's design at home. Right? Maybe men, right? Men, there is a calling in our lives to be the leaders of our home. And maybe you're not leading your home and your wife like God has called you to. Maybe you as an individual have become incredibly passive. You're a passive husband, right? You just sit back and, man, unless the problem literally lands on your front door, you're not doing anything about it. You let your wife run with it. Maybe you're absent. You're never home. Maybe you don't reflect the love of Christ. Maybe instead of being passive, right, you're incredibly dictatorial and you tell her what to do, and that's not God's picture of a healthy marriage as well. Right? Men, you're called to be the leaders of your home. And women, right, we need strong leadership from women as well, and women can be leaders in their home. But maybe you have this design issue mixed up, and you fail to follow the leadership of your husband. Right? Maybe you put the pants on, right, and you take the reins of leadership in your home. You tell him what to do. Maybe you belittle him because of his lack of presence. Maybe you don't even view your marriage as a partnership. But the reality is, men need their wives just as much as wives need their husbands. Right? They're meant to, again, complement each other. Going back to Genesis. Right? One is not better than the other, but they're meant for each other. Right? In my relationship, like Paige is many things that I am not, and I'm many things that she is not. And we come together to make our home work. And this is the picture of what our home should look like, right? Men, husbands are to lead. And women, they are to follow Christ faithfully as they follow the leadership of their husbands. And so men, right, you need to be worthy of that calling, right? Be worthy of someone that someone would want to follow. It's important for us to celebrate our spouse's gifts and our differences. Right? Again, God made us different. And this is by design. Maybe you're not getting much out of the church service because you ignore God's basic design for leadership in the home, and it overflows in the context of this church. And here's where it connects to our church. Passive, absent men in the home are passive and absent men in the church. Right? If someone is not leading their family well, realistically, they're not leading in the church well. And women who control and run their homes and belittle their husbands, they're going to come in the church and they're going to want to do that as well. All right, so what you see here is you see a connection. What happens in the home comes to the church. And when we ignore God's design, we encounter problems. There's a picture here. I'm not sure if you've ever seen this. This is Latin. I don't know Latin, but we're going to say it's ecce homo. Right? It means behold the man. It's a painting by a 20th century Spanish artist named Elia Martinez. And so it depicts Jesus there wearing a crown of thorns. It's about 100 years old, and for about 100 years it has been hanging in this church. I believe it's been in Spain. And over time, this beautiful painting has become faded. Obviously, there's been cracks in it. And in 2012, this 80-year-old parishioner sees this faded painting. She's got a set of painting skills herself, and she decides she's going to do what she can to help restore this beautiful painting. Here's the result. Even though, right, she had the best of efforts, that is her version of the restored painting, right? She literally painted over that beautiful painting, and this is what she made, right? I think it's been now dubbed the monkey Christ, because that's kind of what it looks like. Though she had great intentions, her efforts made that painting look a whole lot worse. And here's the thing, I've already alluded to this as well. When God has his people come together, we should be better off because we came together, not worse off. Right? That painting should have looked a whole lot better after she worked with it, not worse. Would have been better if she didn't touch it at all. And the reality is for some churches, it's better if they don't gather at all, because when they come together, they're worse off for it. Here's the thing. Why doesn't the church service do much for us? Maybe it might not do much for you because you are self-absorbed. Again, we're addressing heart issues. Heart issues in the home. Heart issues that we are dealing personally. Right? We're self-absorbed. It's all about us. You see, God intends when his people come together, they're better off because they came together, not worse off. We start moving through these a little quicker. Verse 17. But in the following instructions, I do not commend you, because when you come together, it's not for the better, but for the worse. I mean, could you imagine getting a letter from the Apostle Paul that said that? Hi, Prairie Community Church, I can't recommend you guys come together anymore because you're a whole lot worse off because you come together. Right? That's quite a condemning statement. And so he says in verse 18, for in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, which again, we've covered that as a church, right? There were divisions on who they were following, divisions regarding their preferences, right? You can imagine the scenario. You've probably been a part of churches, maybe in this church, where you're not encouraged or uplifted because as you come together, these divisions are brought to a head. He continues, and I believe that in part, for there must be factions among you in order that those who are genuine among you may be recognized. And what he's saying there is the true followers of Christ and false followers are often revealed in the scuffle, right? Some of the things you're arguing about, some of the positions you take, those who are genuinely there to honor and worship and see Christ's name go forth, usually are revealed through that scuffle. But here is how this selfishness came to a head in the Corinthian church. It was actually dealing with the Lord's Supper. Verse 20 to 22. When you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat. For in eating, each one goes ahead with his own meal. One goes hungry and another gets drunk. What? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I commend you in this? No, I will not. So something that you need to be aware of that's going on behind the scenes here in the Corinthian church, and this is not something that we practice, but what they did as a church is they would come together. When they did, they would have something known as the charity meal, right? Sometimes it's called the love feast. Think of it like a potluck. And so just like in any church, there's a range of demographics and financial positions. And so those who had means would bring food to this meal, and they invited everyone to come and eat. And after they ate, they would partake, right? They had their service, and they would partake in communion. And so originally, this was a really beautiful thing in the church. They were taking care of real physical needs in their church. They were feeding people physically and spiritually. But what this evolved into was it became a party of sorts. For those who had means, they came together, they brought their best food, they ate, they got drunk, and they kept those who had needs at arm's length. Right? So what came and started out as something beautiful became this ugly depiction of division. They were coming together and abusing the love feast, this charity meal, and really neglecting the purpose of why it occurred altogether. The wealthy believers ate first and left nothing for those truly in need. And here's the thing. There was great selfishness taking place in that church. The intended unity of the church was displaced because people were self-absorbed. They didn't want to self-reflect. It was about them and getting their meal, and they weren't worried about anybody else in the church. And maybe you don't get much from the church in our gatherings because there's some heart issues that you're wrestling with. It's all about you and what the church can do for you. And when that is your heart, as you walk in the doors here, there's no wonder why you might feel like you don't get much. It's not about you, right? It's about Christ. It's about your fellow brother and sister sitting next to you. That is something the Corinthian church fundamentally misunderstood, and we see that by the way in which they practiced communion. So, you might not be getting much because you ignore God's design. Maybe you're a little self-absorbed. But we don't like to evaluate ourselves, do we? Right? We don't like to examine our own hearts. Because when we do, we realize that maybe we need to change. There's a lot of examples like this. People who say one thing and do another. People who fail to grow, to self-evaluate. And we don't like to do that again because change is hard, right? The older we get, the more set in our ways we are. And this is the reality as well, a heart issue that we can experience. Why the church service might not do much for us. Because we hesitate to examine ourselves. The rest of our text, 23 to 26, we read that as we partake in communion as a church every first Sunday of every month. Those are just instructions or the kind of the process for taking the Lord's Supper. Remember, the Corinthian church has failed to follow those well, and so Paul reminds them why they partake in communion, why they come together. So what he does then is he follows up in verse 27 to 29, and he calls them to evaluate themselves, right? Before you partake in communion, pause, judge your heart, assess where you're at. Verse 27, whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and blood of Christ. Let a person examine himself then, and so eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment on himself. There's a call for one to evaluate themselves before they take communion. And here's the thing. Paul says that there are real implications of failing to evaluate yourself and to adjust yourself. Verse 30 to 32. That is why many of you are weak and ill, and some have died. But if we judged ourselves truly, we would not be judged. So when we are judged by the Lord, we are disciplined, so that we may not be condemned along with the world. So the Corinthian church is experiencing real problems because they are failing to self-evaluate and deal with the issues in their heart. Paul attaches some illnesses and death in the church because of heart issues. Verse 34 and 34 to 33 to 34, we see some additional instructions. But this is what I want us to see, right? Paul calls the church to examine themselves. Again, some in the Corinthian church experienced weaknesses and sicknesses and death because they failed to do this. Right? So taking communion as a church is a serious business that they did not take seriously. Paul encourages them to avoid selfish behavior, to examine their heart. If this church service doesn't seem to be doing much for you, it's a good chance, an opportunity for you to evaluate your own heart. Again, sometimes churches get it wrong, right? We're full of broken people. Pastors mess up. Leaders mess up, right? We will hurt you. But the reality is, often if you are feeling very critical of the church, often it's a heart issue on your part that you need to address first. Right? Evaluate your heart. How are you doing spiritually? What needs attention in your life? This is what Paul is getting at in this text. Right? When we ignore God's design, when we're self-absorbed, when we hesitate to examine ourselves, no wonder why if you come in here, you feel like you're not encouraged, it's not doing what you think it should, it makes sense, right? You're already struggling before you walk in this door, and you're bringing your mess in here as well. Now, I had this problem with the bats, and clearly I did not know how to take care of them. So I called a guy out to come and assess the situation. He gave me a price that I didn't want to pay. And then he gave me some advice, right? He told me, hey, if you pay me this money, this is exactly what to do. And so I said, thank you, here's $100. I'm going to go do exactly what you told me to do. And we were able to deal with the issue, right? Got to seal the holes. I installed a lot of bat cones. I followed the advice of a professional. I wasn't getting the result I wanted, so I sought out a professional, someone who knows these bats in and out and how to deal with them here in the state of Nebraska. And if you come into the doors of church and you feel like it's failing you, maybe you need to go back to the person who designed this, right? If you ignore God's design, you're going to have a problem. If you ignore your heart issues, you're self-absorbed, you don't want to examine yourself, you're going to have a problem. So I hope that if you come in the doors and you're feeling discouraged and you feel like High Prairie Community Church is failing you, I hope that it's not something that we're doing as an organization. We do everything we can to get this right, though we do mess up. But I want to encourage you first to check your own heart. That's what Paul encourages the Corinthian church to do, and this is what we need to do as well. 2 questions for you. First one for the husbands, for the wives, and then just an additional one for fun. Husbands, do you treasure your wives and lead them well? And then wives, do you follow the leadership of your husbands and help him glorify God? And then, how many of your concerns with the church stem from your own heart issues? Let's bow our heads in order of prayer. God, thank you for allowing us to come together. Thank you for this letter. And Lord, I pray for any individual who comes on the doors of the church today who is discouraged, who's frustrated, feeling like the church has just failed them. Man, God, I know the heart of this church and the heart of the leadership is, man, we want to meet people where they're at. We want to see them grow. We want to be encouraging. But the reality is, Lord, sometimes we do fail. We do mess up. Help us to be aware of where that is and help us to address it as an organization. But God, I know often, too, we come in with these issues and we ultimately just blame the church because we don't want to look at ourselves. So God, I pray for our homes, Lord, that us as husbands lead our wives well, and wives that we submit to the leadership of our husbands and support them and represent God through how we function in that relationship. Lord, may that overflow into our homes. Lord, may we be willing to look at our own hearts and evaluate the needs of this church. And Lord, may we address these hard issues. God, we struggle to get this right, so we need your help. So help us this week, Lord. In your name, amen.